This transformational change that people go through, it makes you wiser. You're a lot wiser to people's bullshit. You're less likely to be taken advantage of politically. I'll put it that way. Nobody can lie to me anymore because I know the truth now. For you to tell me that, we need to have haves and have-nots, right? That's the way our society has to be set up. No, it doesn't, right? You're a liar is what you are. Whole psychological aspect of this thing is the thing that I really harp on because that's where I think the real world value comes in for the everyday person. Not only in terms of, the science and inventing technologies, but also just the knowing, right? We're at a point where we're either going to lose everything and go back to hunter-gatherers, or we're going to move forward, and if I have anything to say about it, we're going to move forward.
Welcome back to The Night Shift, your safe space for talking about UFOs, UAPs, NHI, and all the other things that your friends and family and coworkers are just so sick and tired of hearing you go on and on about. Let's face it, you talk about this stuff a lot. They are zoning out. See that 1,000-yard stare? That's them imagining someplace else they'd rather be. Don't let them tune you out. Come hang out with us. We're glad you're here. If you're not already a member, just hit that subscribe button. Join Team Night Shift. We've got a great group, and I'd love to have you be a part of it. This subject is inherently fascinating. I mean, that's why we're all here, right? It's got all the hallmarks of great science fiction. It's got time travel, biologics, non-human intelligence, interdimensional beings. It's got hardware. It's got special forces guys. It's got crash retrieval, recovery, and reverse engineering operations. It's got secret government labs, underground facilities. It's all there. And yet, I find one of the most fascinating aspects of all of this is the personal transformation that one goes through after a truly anomalous experience. In my own case, I had an anomalous experience. A period of catharsis took place afterwards that changed my consciousness in a profound way. Things that used to matter to me didn't matter to me anymore. Things that didn't matter to me were suddenly priorities. And I felt this as sort of a shift in my paradigm. I'm very interested in that, and I explore it a lot on this channel by talking to people who have had anomalous experiences and trying to get a sense of how those experiences changed their worldview. So I'm really excited to talk to my next guest, Matthew Roberts. Matthew is a former Navy cryptologist and the author of Initiated, a fantastic book. You can see mine's full of bookmarks and notes. I cannot recommend it enough. He was stationed on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt during the infamous gimbal incident, and he was one of the very first people to see that footage in a skiff on board the ship. And he watches it again and again and again and again. And he has a very strong emotional internal reaction to it. And later in the book, he talks about having numerous experiences with beings, non-human intelligences visiting him in his room, and how that kicks off an entire shift in his mental picture of the world, his paradigm, his personality that continues to affect him to this day. It's a fascinating story. I cannot recommend it enough. We got to sit down recently and get into this. It was a great conversation. I had a lot of fun. Matthew was very kind, very generous with his time. And we covered it all. We talked about hardware. We talked about secrecy. We talked about the cover-up. We talked about the expansion of consciousness that seems to come with these types of experiences and how that plays out on an individual level and on a human level, as a group, as a species, at the species level. Matthew did a great job of explaining his own personal journey in a way that I felt was very relatable and reflected my own journey in many ways. And I think you're going to find pieces of your own stories in what Matthew has to say. I am so glad you're here. Thank you for being a part of Team Night Shift. If you're not already a subscriber, please hit that subscribe button and join the conversation. Thanks for being here. Don't forget to like and share this video. Now let's get to the interview. My next guest is Matthew Roberts. Matthew is a former U.S. Navy cryptologic technician who served on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt. His book, Initiated, UAP Dreams, Depression, Delusions, Shadow People, Psychosis, Sleep Paralysis, and Pandemics was published in November 2020. The book delves into his personal experiences and interpretations related to unidentified aerial phenomena and other paranormal occurrences. Roberts was involved in the 2015 events where the USS Theodore Roosevelt's fighter jets recorded the infamous gimbal UAP footage. This incident contributed to the Pentagon's later publication of a report on UAPs revealing the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, also known as ATIP. Following his experiences, Roberts transferred to the Naval Intelligence Office in Washington, D.C., where he accessed more classified information, discovering that such phenomena were frequent. He later left the Navy in March 2020 after 16 years of service to share his experiences publicly. Roberts' book combines elements of memoir and paranormal investigation, discussing his encounters with shadowy figures, sleep paralysis, and the broader implications of non-human consciousness. He is now pursuing a degree in psychology to better understand and impact this field, with plans for a second book focused on his personal journey and mental health. Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today. It's truly an honor to get a chance to chat with you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
A lot of people, the majority, it seems like, come into this after having an anomalous experience and then very quickly find themselves in a exploration of their own personhood, their own experience of consciousness, the universe, the wider universe in general. And so I wanted to talk to you today about the overlap between the experiences that you describe in the Netflix Encounters series with on board the Roosevelt, which were very nuts and bolts, verified by multiple sensor systems events, and the events that you describe in your book, which seem to cross the barrier between this world and the world beyond. So I was hoping today we could get a little bit into that and maybe start with the title of the book. Could you explain why you chose to call it Initiated and what was behind that title?
The reason I chose that title was just because that's how I perceived everything that had happened to me. I kind of recognized that it was an initiatory experience, and that these initiations have been going on throughout humanity's history, and you can see that in mythology and religion and lore from all over the world. Not just Western culture. So it became obvious to me that this was like a much deeper thing than anybody is giving it credit for. It's highly complex and very nuanced. And so, that's why I chose that title. And that was basically it. I thought of myself as someone who had been initiated into something,
Do you have a sense that this is a global phenomenon as much as it is a personal one for individuals who are going through it? Is this something that we're experiencing as a species, or is this more of an experience that individuals are going through one-on-one as they encounter the phenomena?
Well, I do think it's that's the whole thing about it, is that I feel like initiation is only accomplished on an individual basis. But the whole phenomenon of this initiation is a worldwide phenomenon, right? Like, people are going through it all over the world. And that's mirrored in world religions. And I would say that it's not even necessarily, I know this is going to sound kind of crazy, but I wouldn't even say that this is necessarily even just limited to humans, right? Because I don't know. I was watching a documentary about the Homo naledi in Africa, and they were burying their dead in caves with grave goods, right? Things that they could take with them. And these are very complex ideas. And they were doing that 200,000 years before Homo sapiens were doing it. and they weren't even human, right? So, what does that mean? I think that means that this isn't just something that's limited to just humans. It's everything that's alive, basically. I mean, and the reason I say that is because, something that I came to understand about all of this is that there is some part of you, some aspect of yourself that survives death, right? And that's not weird. That's not woo. It's just what it is, And there's a great deal of scientific evidence for that. The University of Virginia has been studying that kind of thing for a long time. The idea of reincarnation. They've got some 2,000 cases with, very strong evidence for that. So,
I think that's what's so fascinating about this topic, and it's one of the things that drew me into it, was how easily the study of the afterlife, consciousness, the experience of birth and death, and just the larger reality. The rabbit hole begins with UFOs and UAPs, but it goes so much farther than that. And it seems like everyone I talk to has a similar experience. They started out, they see the video, they become interested in the topic, they're looking for UFO information, but before long, their book of like esoteric knowledge, or their stack of books about esoteric knowledge, is growing. Like it's truly astonishing how quickly one leads to the other. And I wanted to maybe back up a little bit to your experience. I know you've told this story a number of times, but I'll ask you to tell it briefly once more. On board the Roosevelt, what was the moment for you where something clicked and changed, and you felt like you were going to be moving in a different direction?
I wouldn't say that moment. Well, I guess, that moment, I think, came much later, but I think kind of the shock of, and the ontological shock of, oh wow, this is real, happened just in watching the gimbal footage. I'm sitting here in a skiff and I'm watching this footage for the first time in 2015. The world didn't see it until much later. And so it's like, okay, I guess all this stuff is real, and my thought about that was, well, I'm just going to put this in the back of my mind. I'm not going to look into it any further, because it seemed a little creepy to me, because I was getting these creepy vibes about all around kind of this idea of this topic. And so I thought, well, I'll just put that away, and if it is obviously real, and I'm obviously not read into whatever program studies this, so I'll never know the truth of what's going on here anyway, so why even go down that rabbit hole?
What was creepy about it, though, for you in that particular instance?
I had a very emotional reaction to it, and I could not understand that at the time. It was very confusing to me, and no one else was having this reaction to it. So that's kind of what I found creepy about it, and I had this feeling that, this kind of creepy, just weird, very off-putting feeling that they were there for me, and I just it made my skin crawl, really, at the time. So I didn't want to go there, and I didn't, there's so much out there about this topic. I didn't know where to start, or what would be, what kind of resources out there would be credible. And along with that feeling, also comes the realization that, okay, not only is this real, but we've been lying about it. Right? Because clearly, if we're encountering it, everyone else is encountering it too. So this isn't like a one-off, right? This has happened before, and and we're lying to the public about it, which is also kind of a creepy realization to come to, because you kind of, I mean, there's all kinds of things I was doing behind closed doors that were, secret and top secret. And a lot of it was just very mundane facts, highly technical stuff sometimes. And it would just be incredibly boring. Like, nobody would want to know this stuff unless you were an adversary or something. Coming across this and then realizing, okay, we've been lying about this too. And it's just, I don't know, it's a very uncomfortable position to find yourself in, honestly.
Just to pull this thread a little bit more, the way that you talk about this is interesting, because it seems like, I mean, the story has always been kind of like, well, there's nothing to see here, and if there is, it's not a big deal anyway. But it sounds like you're describing a situation where it's way, way, way more common than people know. And it's like, how much more common is it than people think it is?
Well, I mean, Ryan Graves has been out there saying that they were seeing these things on a daily basis off the East Coast. So, daily,
Yeah.
I mean, it's constant. And I wasn't there behind closed doors at the time, so I didn't know, how frequently this was happening, or if that pace had picked up at all, or if it was slowing down. There are people who know this, obviously. But I was not one of them.
Is your sense, you seem like a very intuitive person who seems to be very, you just seem very switched on to what's going on. Do you have the sense internally that this activity is picking up? And if it is it leading to something? Is this building to some kind of resolution? Or are we just in a new phase of this where we're able to see more because we're looking more and we have better eyes to look with?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, part of me thinks that maybe we weren't picking these things up because our sensors just weren't tuned to it. And I think others have alluded to that. But then at the same time, like, why weren't our sensors attuned to that? And it makes me kind of think that maybe that was on purpose. Right? Because they knew these things happen all the time, and they thought, well, we need to kind of block that from people so they don't see it and they don't know.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, why else would you filter that kind of stuff out?
Sure.
If you're going to, I get it. Like, you don't want ghosts in the system. So anything that seems like an impossibility is just going to get thrown out. It's going Mach 5 or whatever. So, that's, that must not be a real thing unless it's like a missile or something like that. And then there's other sensors that pick. So, I mean, it's just, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I wish and I hope that someday someone's going to be able to explain all of that to the public,
Well, that's a great follow-up question is, do you think is our posture really changing? Does it just appear that way because people are switched onto it and we're all watching for any activity that we can find? Or is what we're seeing, like vis-a-vis the Schumer amendment and the push in Congress for disclosure, is that leading to something, do you think? Or is this another smokescreen that's going to go nowhere?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's a smokescreen. I think that there are people who want this to come out. Yeah. Right. But and so I don't think this is just, for show. I think that there are probably people behind closed doors that, this is their worst nightmare. They don't want to see this happening. And so I don't know who's going to win out in that situation. I wish I had a crystal ball.
Sure.
And I knew, but But at the same time, after everything that I've been through, I kind of look at the situation and I think, well, is anybody keeping this from you really? Because you can know these things for yourself. It takes
Right.
a certain amount of bravery and courage to be able to confront things like this. But you can certainly know for yourself.
I wonder about that a lot. And how, like, what are people really waiting for? Like, what would it take to really change the paradigm from old to new? Would it be like a mass showing event where suddenly we all see the same thing at the same time, and then we can get on with our lives and we go, okay? Or is it something that each person has to experience individually, one by one, until some kind of critical mass is reached? In your own personal experience in the book, you describe a series of events that play out, but there's a particular turning point that you talk about actually encountering beings, the first time that you encounter a being. And I'm very interested in that. Can you take us back to that part of your story and elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the New York Times article had come out that had hit, and there was all of this hubbub around that. And then, the footage, the gimbal footage was released, and that hit me kind of like a ton of bricks because, here I am watching this footage now on my phone, and this was something that I had seen in a skiff, and I couldn't make sense of, because normally those two things would never happen, and I thought that this footage would never see the light of day. I honestly thought I would never see it again.
So did you think at the time you were just kind of like quietly freaking out about it in a room and everybody else was just going about their day and you're like, guys, are you not seeing this? Or was it more like everyone was kind of freaking out a little bit, but no one wanted to talk about it and it was just kind of like that? Or
you mean in terms of like being at O&I or on the ship?
Initially, when you were on the ship and you started to watch it again and again, and you were just like, what am I looking at here? Like,
yeah, I mean, there were people who were talking about it.
Yeah.
On board, but it wasn't everybody, not everyone was aware of what was going on. Because as I said, these things were shown, they were kept in a skiff. So, it wasn't like everybody on board had access to that. Right. It was like handfuls of people, maybe out of the 5,000 people on board. So, I mean, I guess, certainly the pilots were talking about it. I heard them talking about it, and then others, within the intel community on board were talking about it. One of my buddies actually was the one who showed it to me because he had come across this and, he had heard people talking about it. So he's like, hey, come here, pull this up, so I did. Wow. So, yeah, I mean, it was out there. And when I got to O&I thought, well, this is kind of the place where this stuff would be happening. So I started asking questions, I was asking around and everybody was just kind of like, oh, I don't know, So, I mean, initially that led nowhere, my questioning of this kind of thing, until I started to have experiences, personal.
And your initial personal experiences, the way that you describe them in the book is it's very interesting because it seems like people who have experiences like yours, if it happened to me, I don't know how I would process it, or even if I could process it, I would probably have a much harder time. But that kickstarts a whole journey for you. Can you go back to that initial incident and just describe that for the audience, and walk us through how that impacted you going forward?
Yeah, so
it's so profound. What you describe is like it's unbelievable to most people.
Right, and I totally get that. Right, I totally understand that. If I were, an outsider looking in, and I saw someone saying this stuff, and telling this story, I would be like, okay, yeah, right. But
Yeah.
it actually happened to me. So I'm in my bed one night and I'm thinking about all this stuff because as I said, the New York Times article had hit. They mentioned names of people: Chris Mellon, Lou Elizondo, Tom DeLonge. So I was reading a lot. I was digging into some valet and stuff like that. Because this is I kind of took that organization to the stars and I kind of like drilled down on that. That's what the analyst in me was doing, right? As an intel analyst, I wanted to drill down and see what was there. And so these were my resources: Tom DeLonge's books, Jacques Vallée. And so I'm in my room one night. There was a lot of creepy stuff that took place prior to this, but this is the first entity experience. So I'm in my room and I'm asleep, and I feel somebody grab my arm, my right arm, as I'm laying there in bed, and I kind of open my eyes and. I'm looking around my room and all of a sudden my room is starting to get blurry. So I tried to lift my hands to my face to, wipe the sleep out of my eyes. And my hands just kind of flopped there at my sides. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't move, and then I remembered, oh yeah, I woke up because somebody grabbed my arm and I could still feel that hand on my arm. And I thought to myself, I should be terrified. There's someone in my room right now in the middle of the night. Right. But I wasn't. I was just kind of, I don't know. I was kind of curious as to what was going on. So being paralyzed, I kind of fight to turn my head to the right to see what's grabbing me. And I can see this outline of a shadowy figure. It's like humanoid, a head, a torso, two arms, kind of bending over me, right? And it's just this black shadowy outline. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, there's somebody in my room, right? And so as I'm watching this, all of a sudden this screen appears, like in front of its face, where its face would be. And it's like this very crisp, high definition, almost super, to the point of being super realistic. And it starts flipping through images of faces of people that I know, right? And then it stops on an image of an ex of mine from 20 years ago. And as I'm looking at this, like all of a sudden my room starts to light up. Like the backdrop behind this shadowy figure, just my room is starting to light up in like this golden light. And like the light becomes these rays of golden light coming out of its head. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, what is going on? Right? This is the strangest thing I've ever seen in my life. And there was a smell too in the room. I can't quite pinpoint it. I guess like the closest thing I could use to describe it would be like, like right before it rains, you can
that
smell
ozone,
like ozone or something. That's kind of like the smell that I was getting from the. And so like I drift off back to sleep, right? And I start having this dream of this ex of me, of mine, and me in this just darkness, and it's like a sexual dream, right? And so all of a sudden, I'm opening my eyes and I'm back in my room out of the dream, and I can see this entity is on top of me, right? And it's got blue skin, and my hands are on her thighs, and she's obviously, having sex with me, right? And her skin is much thicker and tighter than normal human skin. And I'm kind of like, I'm still kind of, I'm paralyzed still. And so I'm like fighting to scan up to see her face. And like I could see her body leading up to her face, but then her face was blurred out. It was just bizarre. I could
Did
not
you feel like
see
you
her
were
face.
so you were paralyzed in the same way that like sometimes when you wake up half asleep, half awake, you were paralyzed, like sleep paralysis kind of thing? Or did you feel paralyzed like you were impaired by some outside force, like some technology was being used on you or some effect was being applied to like subdue you?
I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that. I remember experiencing that as a child. I would wake up and, I would hear voices in the house. I remember this very clearly, and I put this in the book too, that, this would happen to me as a kid. And I have memories of like fighting to try and get out of bed, and feeling like my body just weighed 1,000 pounds. Every limb just is 1,000 pounds, and it's so hard to move. And that was what it was. I mean, I guess that people describe that as sleep paralysis, but one of the reasons why I put that in the title is because I think that when people do experience sleep paralysis, this is what they're experiencing. And that it's not some trick or malfunction of the mind, so much as there's something is going on there, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's kind of like my description of it. Just your body, everything just weighs like 1,000 pounds.
So when you're trying to look up at this being and you're unable to do it, what happens next, and how does the situation conclude?
Yeah, so I'm like in and out of this dream state several times and back in my room. Obviously, because something is actually physically happening to me. So, it's hard to remain asleep in that state. And so I was just kind of in and out of it. And then I woke up the next morning all of a sudden. And it was the daylight was coming through my window. And I just kind of sat up in bed and I was just like, what happened last night? And I felt sick, because I even at the time that this was happening, I was in and out of the state. I thought to myself, there's got to be some kind of craft, parked in the backyard that she came in. Right. And, it wasn't something that I put together until much later, but, about a week before this incident, I woke up in the middle of the night. My roommate, his room was directly below mine downstairs. And I woke up because I heard this glass breaking, and then I heard, the back door open up because he had a patio and a back door right there off his bedroom. And his dog like ran out and was barking. I could hear her going off into the distance as she's barking at something. And he texts me as this is right after this. And he says, I think there was someone in the backyard because I woke up. He didn't have his glasses on, so, and he's like blind without them. But he woke up and he could see like the outline of a person standing on the deck. And he went to go grab his glasses and he pushed the lamp off his nightstand and it shattered on the ground. And that was the glass breaking that I had heard.
So it wasn't like a poltergeist sound. It was him making the sound, but he was reacting to something.
Right. Yeah. Something a person that was standing on the back deck. And so he let the dog out, to chase whoever it was. And then he texted me, all panicked. And I was like, oh, it's probably the deer. He had in Maryland, in this particular area, there were always deer that would hop the fence and he had like tomatoes and stuff growing out there on the patio. I said, it was probably just some deer out there eating your plants. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. But then when this happened, I was like, wait a minute, maybe that was something. Cause that was just a week before that, you know. So I don't know. I mean, you know, when
I'm sorry, go ahead. I want to jump in with a question, but please finish your thought.
Yeah. So you know, a lot of people ask me, well, how do you know, you weren't dreaming? And it's because I was in a dream, right? And then out of it, and then in it, and then out of it, and back in my room. So it wasn't like, I didn't know that. It wasn't like they were both dreams. There was
no question, in other words, in your mind that this was a real physical event happening in real time. And if someone else was standing in the room, they would have seen it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Because that was my question. So many people struggle with this part. And I feel like there's like this gray area where people would rather this topic stay, where it's kind of like, well, it was just probably a dream and it's okay. And I find very few people are willing to come forward and say, no, it's very real. It's very physical. And that was what was so surprising about, as I was reading your book.
Yeah.
But from there, it puts you on this entirely different trajectory. Let's just stay with the encounter though for a second. What you're describing, Whitley Strieber described in his book Communion, and so many other people have described it. Do you have a sense that this is part of the same thing, or are these different experiences happening to different people for unrelated reasons, or is there some larger purpose at work here, or is this something specific between you and the phenomenon that you experienced?
Yeah, a lot of people like to say that there are different things going on here, and that, there's a lot of different races and they all have their own agendas and, so on and so forth. But my experience of the phenomenon, I did see, other entities that clearly weren't necessarily that related, but they were all working towards the same end, right? And I think that when people, are experiencing different things, right, that has to do with their own perception of things. It's all about perception. And so, what's evil to one person could be a lesson to another, right? And it depends on, well, what I've found is that it depends on your psychological makeup, right? There are people who, after some tragedy, they recover very quickly, right? They're very resilient. And then there are others who, when they have that same kind of tragedy in their lives, 20 years later, they're still on it, So that's kind of what is at the core of this. And that's why people have these, quote unquote, different experiences, right? Where it's an evil thing, or it's a good thing, or, one or the other. But I certainly can see, even in these people that say that, oh, my experiences were all evil entities, I can see that mine were exactly the same as theirs. I just arrived at a different conclusion because of my psychological makeup, right? And that's the whole consciousness component of this, is that there is a conclusion, there is a point to it, right? It's not just nothing.
When you sort of begin your journey into understanding what's going on, you start to really look deeply into esoteric wisdom and religion, and you kind of go there for answers. Did you already have a strong foundation in those areas when you set out on that, or was this something that you built up as you went along?
No, not at all. It was something that that first experience in my room, right? I with the whole light show, the light behind the entity and the rays of light coming out of its head. My immediate thought, even the next morning, was that looks like religious art that I've seen all over the world.
Right.
Right? I don't care what the religion is. There's always some divine entity with gold coming out of its head, or, you know, some kind of illumination behind it. And I knew immediately, okay, I'm not the first person who's seen this. So where am I going to find answers about this? And, you know, that seemed to be the place to look based on what I had just experienced. So it kind of made sense to go down that avenue, because it wasn't me putting this in the context of something that I wanted it to be. I was an atheist, right? I did not believe in any of that. I thought going to church was ridiculous. And I still do to some extent. But, you know, I thought that there was nothing to any of that, right? It was just a dead end, and people have their beliefs, and there was nothing there. But apparently there is what I was getting at, because I experienced this. And so that's where I started looking for answers.
So in your case, it was literally seeing a physical being in your room, and then this amazing light show experience that happens. You're watching what appears to be a high resolution, like digital screen in front of you. Was it like a hologram of changing faces? Is like a disguise, like some kind of camouflage kind of thing? Or was it more to evoke an emotional response from you?
I you know, in the book, I describe it as like, it was almost like there was a tablet in front of this entity's face, and it just was projecting onto that tablet things that it was pulling out of my head, you know?
Like it was looking for the person that you would react to a certain way, and then connect to.
Perhaps. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so they knew that this individual, whoever it was, knew that this is the reaction it wanted from me. And so this is what I'm going to see now, right? Is this person. And it was just, was nuts to think about, you know, but also it was, at the same time, it was very scary, right? Because, at the time, you got to understand, like when something like that happens, right? And it's some kind of non-human intelligence, and somehow they know who you dated 20 years ago. It becomes a little creepy, right? Because it's like, have they been watching me somehow? You know, they know what's going on. And so it does get it's frightening. It is very frightening. And then the oddity of the things that occur after that, it's just very, it will rock your foundation for sure.
It's a shocker. It really is. And I mean, that's the thing. I mean, is it evil or is it not? Well, it's a sexual assault. I mean, if that's, you know, what is that? First of all, it's maybe not breaking, but it's definitely entering your domicile without your permission. So some being from somewhere else is coming here, and then sexual, at the very minimum, assaulting people. That is in and of itself difficult for a lot of people to just kind of grok. But and your reaction seems to be perfectly natural and in line with what anyone would experience afterward. But this path that it sets you on of synchronicities and strange events and confluences of things that sort of lead to you putting this book together is really fascinating. And you zero in on in particular the Kybalion, which I have a copy of right here, which was actually weirdly on my coffee table, which it's never there. It's always on the shelf. But when I was reading that in your book, I looked up and there's the Kybalion. So I have to reach out to Matthew and see if I could talk to him. Can you take us on that a little bit? Can you explore that with me a little bit? What happened there?
Yeah. So before that experience with the entity in my room, I had this kind of very frightening experience, a series of coincidences where it became clear to me that something was watching me, that I didn't know what or who it was, but they were certainly aware of everything that I was doing and thinking. And so that was very scary. And during all of that, like, the Kybalion was just kind of placed in my lap, and it's like, you will read this, right? And so I did. And it didn't make a lot of sense to me initially. In fact, initially I was like, I'm not going to read it. You know, this book sounds crazy, which then the following day, there was that very frightening series of events that was like, oh no, yes, you will read this. And so, you know, it was, in meeting experiencers and talking to them, a lot of them have this book, and that is not a coincidence.
For people who aren't familiar, can you set up the book a little bit and explain what it is? Because it looks, if you just look at it, it looks like something you'd find at an airport in the kiosk. Yeah. What is the Kybalion, and why is it so significant? Yeah,
so it was first, it was authored anonymously by, you know, the three initiates back in, I think, 1908. It was first released. And since then, they've been able to discern, because it was published by this guy who owned a publishing company called the Yogi Publication Society, right, back in the early 1900s. And so he was one of the authors of this book. And it basically lays out the 7 universal principles that govern the universe, right? Which, it's a very thin book if you look at it, right? It's super thin. You can read it in an afternoon. And I prefer to actually listen to it. You can go on YouTube and listen to readings of it. It takes about 3 hours. But it is so just jam-packed with information for as small as it is. And like I said, it goes over kind of the 7 universal principles that govern the universe. And it doesn't really go into a lot of detail into how those kind of manifest, those 7 principles manifest and play out. The author simply states that, you know, we'll leave you to figure that out for yourself.
Right.
You know, which is difficult to do. I think, you know, a lot of people don't understand that book. But I certainly, it's one of my favorites now. I love it. I love that book.
And it even says in here that the book kind of finds you when you're ready for it. Isn't that strange? Don't you find that weird?
Yeah. And when I read that, after these strange things were happening to me, these impossible, very frightening things. And I read, oh, you know, when you're ready for this teaching, so will this book come to you, such is the law. You know, like the hair on the back of my neck just stands up. You know what I mean? It's like, ugh, what does that mean? You know?
What does it mean? I mean, like, let's just cut to the quick here. At the end of the day, how do you reconcile what's in the Kybalion, which is this, like, just very thin, like you said, packed with information, but for the size, it's amazing. And the gimbal or go fast videos, how do we connect those two dots? How do you connect those two dots?
Well, you know, I connected those two dots in just that, you know, I'm kind of, mythology was something that I was somewhat familiar with, because my father was very into that kind of thing. He loved Joseph Campbell. You know, I grew up watching Bill Moyers and Joseph Campbell interviews on TV, which are excellent interviews, by the way.
PBS.
Oh, yeah. And so, you know, I was familiar with the idea of the hero's journey, right? And it's the story that has always been told. And every hero epic, right, matches this kind of journey, right, known as the hero's journey. And so, you know, when that happened to me, when all of this happened to me, that was kind of, I realized that, you know, at the beginning of the journey, there's something that grabs you, something that grabs your attention. And then for you as the observer of that, it becomes like, will I or won't I try to figure out what's going on here?
Do you follow that rabbit hole
right.
or not? Red pill, blue pill.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
And so, initially I kind of refused it. And there's this whole thing in the hero's journey where there's the call to the call to adventure, right? And then there's the refusal of the call, and then you get called up again and you take it, right? And so that's kind of the path that I took. That wasn't initially completely obvious to me, but I think that those themes, I kind of understood those themes, and so at the end I was able to kind of put all of that together and say, oh wow, that's what this was.
Are you saying that these things are connected in and of themselves, or are they? Is the hero's journey something that you're mapping onto your own experiences to process them and help work through what was going on, or is there some tie between them beyond that?
Meaning that, well, I think that so it wasn't that I mapped necessarily my experiences onto that as it was happening. As it was happening, I kind of took the analytical approach in that weird things would happen and I just would say, okay, that was so weird, I don't know what to do with that, right? I don't know what that means. I have no context where I can fit that into anything. So I'm just going to reserve judgment and I'll sit on it and wait and see what happens. Right. And so, so that's what I did initially. I wasn't necessarily putting this all together as the hero's journey. I didn't do that until the end, obviously. But I was keeping a journal the whole time because I realized that what was happening to me was significant in some way. And so that journal then helped me write the book later. I went back through my journal and I just wrote the book based on my journal entries.
And so it all kind of just came together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you were able to process it all through writing the book.
Right. And I will say too that, the Kybalion was written by the three initiates, right? And that wasn't something that I picked up on either, that this was some kind of initiatory experience. Until later on, I read a book called The Archetype of Initiation by a Jungian psychoanalyst named Dr. Robert Moore. And then as I was reading that book, that was like, oh my gosh, the Kybalion by the three initiates, all this stuff that happened to me. That's what this was, I'm not the only one who knows this. There's lots of people who know this. They may not necessarily put that together with, the whole UFO alien phenomenon. They may view it through a different lens. I've talked to plenty of people who, they never saw a single entity, non-human entity or anything like that. So, they were lucky enough to go through it without that. But I think that maybe, this journey has a way of just kind of, it'll give you what you need in order to make it happen, if that makes sense. And so had this not been like punching me in the gut and smacking me in the face and kicking me in the ass in the way that it did, I might not have continued. I may have just quit and said, I don't know what's happening here. This is weird. Maybe I'm going crazy. But that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I realized that all of our experiences are the same with the phenomenon, whether we like to admit it or not. they're all very similar. There's a point to it. People get stuck in initiation for decades because they just don't. They're just not psychologically putting things together in the right way. And so if they had someone maybe who was, sitting there asking them questions, leading questions that will get you to the point, then maybe you'd be better off. Or if there was a book, that people could read.
That might shed some light.
Yeah.
Sure. I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. It's the connecting the dots between military hardware, nuclear weapons systems being shut down and interfered with, sensor systems being interfered with, fighter jets, tangible real world nuts and bolts things. And then this experiencer side that almost always inevitably leads to a total internal catharsis and metamorphosis of the personality. And it's my experience to a certain degree. I felt my personality evolve very quickly, and I changed into, I'd let go of a lot of poor habits and bad things that I was just that weren't serving me. And I went on a very similar journey of self-discovery, and it led right through the heart of all of this esoteric wisdom. And I found myself kind of on the other side of it, reading your book going, oh, it happened to someone else. This is amazing. I need to talk to them. How do we bridge the gap in this community between military hardware and the evolution of our consciousness? Is that a gap that we're in a position to bridge now? Or do we need more time for this thing to cook before we're going to understand how those things all come together?
Right. Well, this is I've watched a few episodes of your podcast, and what I like about it is I watched, I think, one of your live streams.
Oh boy, those are new. I'm sorry.
Yeah. There was someone who kind of got a little bit upset in the chat because you were bringing up politics, right? And you kind of, I think rightly put that in its right place and said, no, this does have to do with politics because, there's all of these things involved. There's government is involved in this. There's crash retrievals. There's technology. There's real stuff here, right? And if you read people like Diana Pasulka, or you listen to interviews that she's done, she certainly talks about how there are people who have this special kind of connection with the phenomenon, and they end up developing technologies, and not just simple technologies, things that are very complex, that are very much needed, right? And so I think in the past, what people have done is, inventors and things like that, I just I tripped and I mixed these two things together and it was an accident, right?
Yeah, a Jerry Lewis.
Right. Sure. Yeah. And it just popped into my head. I don't know where it came from, and so it becomes somewhat acceptable for people to say things like that. If they're inventing technology, or if they're considered a genius, right? But if you really dig into some of these people's backgrounds, you can begin to find that they follow this esoteric stuff because they've had contact, right? And that's why they can do what they do. And so I think that that's where we need to bridge the gap, right? There's this disconnect between, spirituality being a belief, and then there's science, right? And science is provable. But I can tell you, plenty of people have had these experiences, and so that too, it's certainly repeatable, and so you can study that if you choose to, right? And so that's what we need to start doing. We need to start looking into this and studying it and taking it seriously, because it is very serious. And in terms of politics, I'll say this, that this transformational change that people go through, It makes you wiser. You're a lot wiser to people's bullshit. So you're less likely to be taken advantage of politically. I'll put it that way. Like no politician,
more empathetic too.
Yeah, and no politician's gonna stand there and be able to convince you of some lie, right? Like nobody can lie to me anymore. Like you can't lie to me, because I know the truth now, right? And so for you to tell me that, oh, well, we need to have haves and have-nots, right? That's the way our society has to be set up. And no, it doesn't, right? Mm-hmm. You're a liar is what you are. And you're projecting psychologically. And the whole psychological aspect of this thing is the thing that I really harp on, because that's where I think the real world value comes in for the everyday person. Not only in terms of, the science and inventing technologies, but also just the knowing, right? Mm. I mean, it's very profound that no one can ever lie to you again. And even if they think they're telling the truth, it's very strange that people can lie and they think they're telling the truth, and they're just a liar. They're lying to themselves and everyone else.
It's hard I actually found for me personally, it was really hard to go. I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't watch commercials. They give me a headache now. Like all of the media, the mass media machine that's just like blasting all the time. I can't do it anymore. I've tried and I can't. And now I have a young son and we're raising him to not really watch TV. It's very hard, but you start to see it everywhere and you go, oh my God, I see it everywhere now. The machine. It's like Noam Chomsky used to say, this manufacturing consent all the time. I lost my thread. Where did I want to go with that? The politics of it seem to be becoming more and more of an issue as this thing comes to the fore. And I wonder if that's maybe the point, like as people become more awake and aware and this, it seems like this confluence of events, right? Like you had the actual event itself in 2015. We had the COVID lockdowns. Some of these events were just like breaking people. They were breaking the pattern of society. Yeah. And that, especially during COVID, I found, particularly then, a lot of people they didn't have the machine running anymore. So they couldn't run on the hamster wheel for a little while. And they were forced to take a break if they were lucky enough to be able to do it and didn't have some job they had to necessarily be at. But that break seemed to create space for a lot of people to take on board this other thing that was happening in the sort of the background. And I noticed that after 2017, the New York Times article, the Netflix series, and as this has become more and more of the story, now you look at it, maybe 15 years ago, if you talk too much about UFOs, you could lose your job. You go on YouTube today and you do a search and you find like Joe Rogan interviews so-and-so and it's got 30 million views. It's mainstream in a way that it hasn't been before. And I wonder if that's what it's going to take to snap people out of this sort of collective delusion that we're all participating in. Do you think there's a connection between the larger events that are playing out, like AI and climate change and all of these other, just the unrest around the world and the military posturing that's going on, and what's going on in the UAP space? Are these two things tied together, or are they happening just next to each other? What can we learn from looking at it all?
So my take on the whole AI thing is that so when I reached the end of this, right, the climax of this whole experience, I came into, I guess you would say, higher consciousness, right? Where, like you, I had a really hard time watching TV. I couldn't even watch the news anymore. It was just like a bunch of whiny children playing house, and it just kind of made me sick, right? And that's the way I viewed them, and I still view them that way. It's almost like I live on this island of children. It's like Lord of the Flies, right?
It does feel that way sometimes, right?
And I'm the only adult in the room, and it's kind of disgusting to walk around out there. But I think so. This higher consciousness that I came into, it was very delicate. My connection to it was very delicate. There is some how would you say? I guess there's some amount of give, right? In that it has a tolerance and acceptance of you kind of drifting psychologically one way or another, and it'll allow for that. But you go too far and it will shut off, right? And that will be the worst feeling in the world when that shuts off. And I feel like it's impossible to remain in that state given the current state of human affairs, right? Because we have to externalize everything, right? I have to go to work. I have to go work for the man, right? and pay the bills, and I've got to worry about my car payment, and I've got to worry about my mortgage, and I've got to worry about all these other stupid things, right? But as we get more sophisticated with our technology, with AI, that will allow us to begin to separate ourselves from the physical world, right? And so I view this as a progression towards that, where eventually we kind of stop working and we can focus on other things like consciousness, and that can take us in another direction. But simultaneously with that, there has to be this understanding that that's what this technology is, and that's what this technology does. It's essentially, I've heard people describe it this way, and I can't think of any better way to describe it other than divine, right? In that it allows you to step back from the physical world. You don't have to worry about your mortgage payment. You don't have to worry about your next meal, because all of that is just taken care of by AI and by robotics and mechanization, and you don't even have to think about it, right? But as I said, though, at the same time, you have to have this lower tolerance for bullshit as this is happening, because that is so easy to destroy, right? One person having a bad day and projecting, and I'm going to upload this virus and destroy everything, right? And that can happen. And so we have to become much more responsible and less tolerant of bullshit, of what I call, what a lot of kind of Jungian psychoanalysts would refer to as extroversion, right? Projection of the subconscious rather than embodying it, right? And so you throw it all out on the world. You throw your subconscious all out on the world because that's what seems real to you, right? Not this inner stuff. And so the danger in doing that, right, is that the subconscious in the mind is very destructive. It wants to destroy anything that doesn't resemble itself, right? And so if you're embodying all of that, right, it's destroying all of these bad ideas, bad habits, bad things that you do, and it's making you right in the head. And if you're projecting that, you set out to destroy the physical world, right? Because you want to destroy anything that does not resemble yourself. This is where all forms of racism come from. And so people need to understand this about themselves so that they can approach the human subconscious much more carefully and delicately, but also so that they can correct others. One of the things that I loved, there was recently this article about Plato, right, and about his death that was recently uncovered. It was some kind of papyrus scroll that they found, which gave this account of Plato's death. And all of the articles I read about it was like, wow, Plato was an asshole, right? Because he's here on his deathbed, and this girl is playing like the flute or music in the room as he's dying, and he chides her because she plays the wrong note, and he corrects her. If people took that and they were like, wow, he's such an asshole, but no, what he's going for is he's going for that perfection, right? It has to be perfect. And any slippage either way is something that is destructive to civilization, right? So that's where you turn the knobs on tolerance levels, right? You're not going to tolerate certain behaviors out of people. And it's up to anybody who witnesses it to correct it immediately, right? And so that's where this has to go, and that's what we have to do. You have to be an asshole.
You get to be a little bit of an asshole. That's a great point. That's a really great way to say that, because it reminds me of something. I was just watching an interview with Annie Jacobson about her book on nuclear warfare the other day. And she was saying how, I think it was something like 6 minutes. President has 6 minutes to make a decision to launch all of our nuclear weapons, or I guess it's all or none, or it's at least it's an enormous amount. And it brought it back in a real serious way to now that I'm a father, to politics for me. And I'm like, these are the two best people we have. Who is going to wake up? Someone's going to wake him up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he's going to have 6 minutes to like shake himself up and like figure out what's going on, and then make a launch decision. Are you kidding me? And I think that, to your point about technology, it's like we seem to be, as a species, passing through a very narrow gate in history where technology is either going to destroy everything, or it's going to open up a potential paradise that we can't even begin to imagine. And it's all in how we play it in the next maybe 10 years, 20 years. I mean, it's not maybe a human lifetime if you want to get on the long view, but not that long in the grand scheme of things. And those decisions that all have to be made are based on the level of consciousness that we have to make them with. We can't even see the better decisions until we get there. Do you see over the next 10, 20, 30 years, what is your best case scenario outcome? What would you like to see happen as this continues to unfold?
Well, I kind of am reluctant to talk about that, because I know that these opinions they're not popular, right? These opinions that I have, and they never have been. Plato wrote about them in the Republic. He talks about kind of some of the things that have to be done. And I'm going to say it because I really don't care what anyone thinks. There's only one way to do this and one way to get this done. One of the things that I don't like is that people raise their own children, right? I think that children need to be raised with civilization in mind, right? We can't have this system where, if you're born wealthy, good for you, and if you're born poor, well, go screw yourself, right? We cannot do that anymore, because we're at a point with technology, just like we were talking about before, that anybody having a bad day can ruin a whole lot of stuff, and so we can't have this tolerance. We have to kind of reel in our tolerance for that kind of have not kind of mentality, and really kind of drive the point home that civilization is what matters, right? All of us are what matters, not who your parents were or what your family does for a living. We've really got to get away from that if we're going to move forward. And so, you have people also who are awful parents, right? They themselves have awful ideas about the world and their place in it. And then they They teach their children that.
Mhm.
And that is horrible. And that is so damaging to a civilization. And we just can't do that anymore. We're at a point where if we're either going to lose everything and we're going to go back to hunter gatherers, or we're going to move forward, and if I have anything to say about it, we're going to move forward.
Well, what else would you, let's just follow that for a little bit. What else would you like to see happen? Like, I actually think what you said is more popular than you think. I mean, most people are kind of fed up with the disparity in wealth that's going on right now. I think a lot of people are looking around going, is really every billionaire that comes down the line, are we supposed to just trust them to solve all of our problems?
Right.
This is like, billionaires are just the smartest people now, and we all work for them. Like, are we going to sit back and really let like 12 guys just own everything? I think people are there, and I think a lot of people are looking for, okay, fine, let's trash this whole thing, but what are we going to put in its place? What's the framework? Like, how do we think about that, stepping into that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was why Plato was talking about the idea of philosopher kings, like people who, and not necessarily that these people have to be kings, right? They can still be democratically elected, but we have to kind of hammer it home that the people who we want to elect have to be people that make us want to be better, right? They can't play to our worst selves. They can't make us want to be worse, right? There's got to be some inspiration there. And if you're voting for someone and they make you want to be better, then you're on the right track. If they play and harp on your worst fears and just the worst aspects of yourself, you're headed down the wrong road, and you're going to destroy yourself with that. And so I think that that's what I would like to see going forward. And, Plato, who lived to see the collapse of Athenian democracy, thought, well, maybe democracy is not the best system, right? Because it's in a democracy, the leaders are going to tell you whatever you want to hear. Right. Oh, you don't have to do anything. Right. You can just sit on your ass. Right. You don't have to think. I'll do all your thinking for you. You don't have to worry your pretty little head. And that's the wrong way to go about this. Everyone should be thinking. Everyone should have their head on a swivel. Everyone should be on guard for bullshit. I'm sorry to keep saying that word. I curse like a sailor.
Oh, I do too. Go ahead.
So, but yeah, that's what I'd like to see moving forward. And, maybe a democracy is not the best thing for that. Maybe it is. I don't know. But I think we're going to have to, at some point, make that decision. And we certainly need people in charge who are true visionaries that can see, point A, where we are now, and point B, where these others are, right, with their technology. They did not destroy themselves. And how did they do that, right? And how are we going to get there? And that's why we need the visionaries, people who know, right, how this works and how this is going to go and how this is going to unfold. Because anyone who hasn't experienced it doesn't know. They just don't. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think that we're in for some rough times here coming up.
You and many others. And to your point, I think about when I was much younger. I remember just a job I had way back when, and I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, and I was eating a sandwich on my break, and I had to go back in and do this terrible, crappy job. And I remember one of the most depressing moments of my life was sitting there eating that sandwich, looking at the parking lot, looking at the strip mall, looking at like all of just the disgusting American landscape. It's just, our corporate landscape is just awful. And feeling like, if this is it, if this is the best we can do, then this just fucking sucks. This sucks.
Right.
I don't want to play this game. This is awful. There's got to be a better way. And I wonder to what extent like the secrecy and the cover up has to do with people. They just don't want people to know, like if there's an alternative and people see that and they go, wait a second, we can do it that way. Sebastian Junger is an anthropologist who wrote a book called Tribe. And in one of the chapters in his book, he describes this the portion in American history where early colonists would leave the colonies and join with the natives and become members of the native tribes. But even if they were rescued, they didn't want to leave. Once they experienced the egalitarian lifestyle that the native people of this country were living, and they realized that that alternative was so much better, they couldn't dream of going back to the drudgery of their regular lives. And I do wonder, like, to what extent this civilization or civilizations that we're dealing with, if it's basically like, what if you took a Buddhist monastery or you took a bunch of Shaolin monks and you gave them everything they need to survive and you dropped them off on Mars and then came back in 10,000 years? Like, what society would that come out of that, would emerge from that? Or 1,000,000 years? And is that kind of what we're dealing with? And maybe that's a piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think that, to your point about native tribes and kind of tribal living, one of the things that I like about Dr. Robert Moore, he talks about the idea of initiation, right? Not just in terms of consciousness initiations, but also in terms of young people, right? To get them on the right track, right? And because they, in tribal societies, they understood, well, we're so few, right? That if you were to have a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old man child within this society, it would be very disruptive, and it would disrupt everything. It would be chaos, and so they didn't tolerate it, right? And so the second you became like this whiny little child on your mother's hip, and became demanding and whatever else, you went through an initiatory phase in childhood, which would snap you out of that real quick, and part of that is it's not pleasant, right? The child may even think through this initiation that their life is in danger, even though it's not, but,
or maybe they need to think that.
Right. Exactly. Right. They need to think that, and because they need to grow up. Right. It's time to grow up and stop hanging on your mother's hip, and your mother's not going to solve all your problems. And you can no longer look to others to solve your problems. You are the problem solver, and you will be a productive, generative member of this tribe, and you won't be disruptive. And so that was the point of that. And we don't do that anymore, right? The only thing we've got that's even close to that is like graduating high school, which is it's a joke, right? It allows you to become the man child you've always wanted to be, right?
Right.
It doesn't do anything for you, and we can't have that anymore. We really can't. And I think, our current political landscape is showing us that we can't have that anymore, right?
It's so awful.
It is. It's staring us right in the face saying, this is what you've made, right?
It's such a gross reflection of our fucked up society. And I look at it and it makes me furious. I'm like, this old man, that you are 1,000 years old and you are clinging to power, desperately trying to convince us that we have to vote for you because the other guy is scarier. And the other guy is scarier. And I don't know which one is actually scarier because it's all so fucking terrifying. And I'm just like, please, can we do anything else besides this? It feels like we're about to just go over the edge of this cliff in a way that is, it almost feels like this system has to break. It feels like it has to break so that we just don't have it anymore. It's almost like you got to rip off the Band-Aid sooner or later. So we have to break the system. Or let it break itself, and then we can pick up the pieces and build something new. But we can't modify this. There's no repairing it. There's no reforming it. It's just too far gone. Do you ever get that sense we're just too far gone, or do you think it can be redeemed?
I hate to admit it, but I do get the sense that it's too far gone. I think that, I think the fact that all of this is happening now, and that you asked earlier about, do I think these things are increasing or not? I kind of like to think that maybe they are, and that we have flaps like this when they're needed, right? And certainly they're needed now, right? Because we are headed in completely the wrong direction. The idea of it breaking, it's not anything new. Civilizations have risen and fallen throughout the history of the world. But it's up to us to grab that and say no more, right? This will be the last time that happens. Because moving forward, we're going to be responsible. And we're not doing this again. And so, you want to be a whiny man-child. Well, no, you won't.
It sounds like you're describing kind of, in a sense, revisiting the idea of the citizen as the basic unit of society, and really drilling down on, like, what is the responsibility of the citizen? Yeah. I feel like somewhere in the last 40 years, it was like we stopped being citizens and just became consumers. Yeah. And you would see it in the news. Absolutely. It was a shift in the vocabulary. They were like, consumers are not happy. Consumers are doing this. It's time to get out there and do that shopping. Consumers are spending. There was no talk of, like, citizens are angry at the government. And we lost that power somewhere in there. And then we just became beholden to whatever ad agencies came up with. What is the role of the citizen? What does a modern citizen need to be? You say have their head on a swivel, be switched on, not listen to bullshit. How does that, what does that look like in everyday life? What does that look like?
Well, I think what it looks like is just understanding the psychology of the human mind, right? Because once you understand that as a baseline, you can identify anything, right? You can identify, oh, that guy over there, he's projecting. I need to stop it. Or this political leader over here that's running for that office, I can see right through them. They're projecting, and they won't get my vote, So at the very least, we all need to understand the human subconscious, how that manifests and what that looks like, so that we can identify it in ourselves and identify it in other people. Right. And so that you understand how important the human subconscious is whenever these entities are around people, right? They always have this, they describe them as being telepathic, right? They communicate telepathically. Well, they're doing that through the subconscious, which is linked through all of us, right? So they're doing that kind of through a base source that we are all connected to. And that's why that's important. And so when people talk about, oh, they're evil entities or whatever, I don't buy it. And I'll tell you why, because the second I had some deviation from center, right, and that shut off almost immediately, any kind of telepathic connection would have been lost at that point. You're no longer capable of that. And so I just don't buy it, and so that's why we need to head in that direction. We need to do this research. We need to understand the human subconscious. A lot of this work has already been done. We just need to teach it, right? Jung was wonderful. I think Dr. Robert Moore kind of nailed things down better than Jung did. I think there's certainly even simpler ways to describe these things. Like, they all talk about archetypes, right? And everybody's like, well, what does that mean? I don't even know how to, there's nothing I can do with that, right? But if you just describe them as not archetypes, but just psychological lines of development along which you can develop yourself, the more you can develop yourself, to resemble the structures of the human subconscious in these archetypes or lines of psychological development, the closer you get to it. And that's the direction we need to go, because that's the truth.
We've gone for almost an hour and a half, and I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I would like to ask, for people who have recently come into this conversation, you have such a broad perspective. What would you tell people? You recommend a number of books in your book. You refer back to a number of different books. What would be maybe your top 2 or 3 books that you would recommend people who are new to this space read to help them on this journey? It can be more than 3, but I just, or 1. But
I would say certainly The Archetype of Initiation by Dr. Robert Moore would be one. Another that I don't mention in this book, actually, because I didn't come across it until much later, was by a guy named Dabrowski. He was a Polish psychologist. He wrote a book called Personality Shaping Through Positive Disintegration. That is a wonderful book as well. I think any kind of experiencer would be able to pick that book up and read it and see themselves in it. And the way that they integrate trauma is kind of what attracts the phenomenon to you, because you're more likely to get it and to put it together and to integrate things rather than the person who's not good at integrating trauma, right? So that would be the second book. The third one, let's see. This one's kind of, it's one of my favorites, but it's not for everybody. There was a book by Mabel Collins, who also published through the Yogi Publication Society. She was an English school teacher. She wrote a book called Idol of the White Lotus. And that book is just like, it is insane. It is a wonderful book. And I don't understand how that hasn't been made into a movie. Because it would certainly be kind of a hero's journey. It could have great special effects. Like all the elements are there. It would be fantastic if somebody made a movie out of that.
What is it? Can you set it up for us just a little bit?
Yeah, so it's a story she wrote, and it's about this boy, Sensa, who's living at, and it kind of ties into what we're talking about here. He's living at the time of the collapse of the Egyptian Empire, right? And his mother takes him to a temple, where he then begins training as a temple priest. And they recognize that he has these special abilities. And so he becomes like this really just impressive, imposing priest. But all of these things happen. The Egyptian Empire collapses at the end of it. It's just a crazy story, but a wonderful one.
Idol of the White Lotus.
Yeah.
Right? Mabel Collins. Okay. Matthew, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you again so much for taking the time to just chat with me a little bit. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about or touched on that you want to get into before we wrap?
No, I don't think so. Just, everybody out there be brave. Humanity's constantly been living on the knife's edge. We always have. So just be brave and everything's going to be all right.
Perfect. We'll leave it there. Matthew, thank you so much. I'll reach out to you in an email once I get this ready to post and put up, okay. But it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Clint. Keep up the good work. Your show's excellent, by the way. I love it.